All
It
right, good
looks
deal.
good. So I will disappear. Bye-bye. And Katie, the stage is
All
yours.
right. Thank you, Jan. I appreciate it so much. And thank you all so much for your patience. I'm not always a MacBook expert, so sometimes I fumble around with these things. But it's nice to meet you all this morning. I'm Kelly Stanton. I'm the Director of Quality here at Qualio. We are a software as a service provider of quality management system software. I come from industry. I've got over 20 years experience. I'm almost about to say, 25. At some point, you just kind of want to stop counting it. But anyway, been around the pharma and the med device industry for a long, long time. Started out in commercial manufacturing as a bench chemist doing that kind of testing, and moved my way out of very repetitive job very quickly and started working in validation. Done a lot of implementations of electronic quality management tools over the years. But I really love the small startup space. And so I kind of fell into that a few years ago, and I haven't looked back. It's been a lot of fun. So today we're going to be talking about migrating to the cloud, implementing an electronic QMS. I'll give you a couple good steps of things to look for, some tips for ongoing compliance success, and hopefully got some successful case studies to share with you at the end, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. If we don't end up with too much time for questions, do still send them in, and I'll be happy to reach out. I'd love to further the conversation. Talking to others in the industry is one of my favorite things to do. Hang around till the end. We've got a white paper to share with you guys as well on how to evolve a paperless eQMS, how to evolve to a paperless eQMS. And it's got some great tips along the way, really rooted in experience. So, quick poll. What does your current QMS look like? Is it all paper? Is it a little bit of paper? Is it all digital? Or are you really early and you don't have any quality management system yet? All right, getting some answers. Love it, love it. All right, I'm gonna give you a few more seconds here, and then I'm gonna end the poll. All right. Perfect. All right, so it looks like about a quarter of you are 100% paper. That's fascinating to me in this day and age, but I certainly understand why people like to stick to it. Got 47%, some paper, some digital. That's good. Starting to move in the right direction. Only 16% of you say you're 100% digital at this stage of the game. And then 9% have no quality management system yet. So interesting. All right. Well, we will chat about that some more here shortly. All right. And one more poll. Excuse me. How much experience do you have with an eQMS? So none at all, some experience, or a lot of experience. And the numbers are bouncing around. I feel like I'm on one of those TV game shows. So, but it looks like we're starting to settle out at an interest. Oh, that's about the breakdown I would expect, to be honest. All right, I'm going to end the poll here. Looks like about half of you have some experience with an electronic quality management system. That's good to hear. About a quarter of you have no experience whatsoever, and a quarter of you have a lot of experience with an electronic QMS tool. So awesome. Well, thank you very much for answering some questions, and we'll dive into where we're going to head next, I guess. So, big burning question, I think lots of people have. How long does it take to migrate to the cloud? I would say it depends on lots of things, right? But one of the things that's important to know, is it's not as hard as you might think it is, or as long. I think the industry average numbers based on what we see is 12 to 24 months. Our average is 60 days or less. And it really is that fast. It's funny. I think people don't believe us when we say we can have all your stuff in the system and organized in 60 days. Now, that's everything there. Implementing the processes on the other side. That's up to you guys, but we can get you started. So if we talk about steps to migrate off of paper and into the cloud, of course, compliance comes into question, right? How do we make sure we do this in a compliant manner? So a couple of, the big things, right? Validate. We're all required to validate our eQMS tool. And we'll dive into some details there. Data migration, how long? That's really kind of the heavy lift. And then training people, getting everyone implemented in the system. All right, so if we talk about validation, make sure the quality system works as intended. Validation includes 3 stages. Right off the bat, risk assessment. It's important that you understand your business, the ways you intend to use that tool, and that you document those decisions. Supplier evaluation, really check out your suppliers. The partnership there, it should be a partnership with your supplier of your eQMS or your vendor. You want to evaluate their processes. Do they have a quality system in place? All of that good stuff. And then requirements testing. That's actually the smallest piece of the whole bit, in my opinion. Software these days is it's pretty straightforward. Things work as intended most of the time. All right. Excuse me. So in your data migration piece, you should start this process before you start shopping for a tool. What records are you going to move? If you've been around a while, are you going to take everything into your new system? I actually don't recommend that. It makes a mess very quickly if you've been around a long time. But if you aren't going to have access to your old system, then you've got to house that information somewhere. So it's certainly a thing to consider. Get as many people involved in the project from a stakeholder perspective. Sometimes I think certainly too many cooks in the kitchen can be a problem, but there's always the little hidden spots of information that maybe you didn't know about or didn't think about as you were marching forward with migrating your data. It was interesting. I think I see some chatter about, failures. I talk about failures, not just successes. I've seen some failures in my career, and usually they came from poor planning, and then they come from poor scoping of, if you're trying to automate a process that's already really complicated and bad, just throwing it into an electronic system isn't going to magically make that better. So go through all your stuff. Scoping, again, so important, so important. This is an opportunity to reimagine your system. It's amazing to me how often people are really attached to the way they do things now. And so they think that going electronic just means they're going to take the existing process and throw it straight into a software tool, or all of these records that historically have always been kept. But I would challenge you to really, truly evaluate the content of the information and the workflows that information is coming out of, and whether or not those things are really necessary. That's a good way to keep from making a mess and making things take longer, frankly. Migration. I think I touched on it a minute ago. Don't migrate everything. It's really not necessary. Back in the day, we used to send records off site, box up paper and send it to Iron Mountain, or for those of you in Europe, I'm not sure what your Iron Mountain equivalent is, but for us, Iron Mountain is that place where everybody sends all their old paper records that you can't get rid of, but you don't use on the regular. Just because you have a new repository doesn't mean you need to move everything into your new tool. So I would definitely encourage you to consider that. Once you've got everything updated, migrated, etc., your provider that you work with should help you get that stuff organized, hopefully partner with you on some best practices. Oh, you guys have Iron Mountain as well. Awesome. That's good to hear. I don't know if you've ever toured Iron Mountain. It's man, it's a sight to behold, the amount of paper generated over the years. Your vendor should partner with you and really guide you through this process, help you get things organized, not just dump your files, into another tool. So again, I strongly suggest that you don't migrate absolutely everything you've got. And yeah, when you're all done, celebrate the migration, celebrate the success. It's a big change. It's a big change. Training. Training, of course, in order to be successful, obviously, you need to know how to use the tool. Yeah, train your admins, train your end users. Hopefully you've picked a system that's relatively intuitive as well. And so that learning curve is a little bit smaller. If you've got people learning the process at the same time, make sure they understand the process too. It's not just click here, this thing happens. Sometimes you need to understand the process before the tool makes sense. So it's important to consider that in your training efforts. And, remember, even the best product can't correct a broken process. It's so important. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a minute. But again, consider the process. Why is it so complicated? How can you make it more simple? So ongoing success in the cloud. Pick the right point people. Chantel, you're talking about people change management must be part of the project. Absolutely. I find that in some of the less successful implementations I've been involved in, it's been done kind of in a silo. The QA people maybe don't talk to all the stakeholders who are using some systems or, get a good scope. Your project manager should have a clear vision for where you're trying to go. Patience and persistence. There's going to be days where this is really not fun to implement. It doesn't matter how quick and easy or amazing the tool is, still change. And, curiosity, have a strong, have somebody who's trusted in your organization. Again, this is a big change. And, the voices all need to be heard, even if not every opinion can be considered. All right. And don't pave the cow path. I grew up a little bit on a ranch. Cow paths, if you've ever seen them, meander all over the place. They're not the most direct route from point A to point B. And so my husband's a software engineer, and he had said something one day to me about, people love to pave their cow paths. And I'm like, oh God, but it's so true. This is an opportunity, like I said, to reimagine your processes and help hopefully line them out a little bit, make them more efficient, and then make them electronic. If you take a really complex sort of bloated process and just throw an electronic tool at it, it isn't magically going to get better. In fact, most of the time that scenario makes it worse, because now you've got people who were already struggling to manage the process having to do it in a tool that's completely foreign to them. So take the time to assess the process. It's an opportunity. You're changing things anyway. So it's a good time to if you're going to implement the change, rip that Band-Aid off and do it all at once. Manage your deadlines. It's amazing to me too how often deadlines are set a bit arbitrarily, or okay, we're going to do this project in 6 months, and they say that before they scope it. Or you get into scoping and there are scenarios where, wow, this is a lot bigger than we thought, but they don't go back to management or the key stakeholders and say, hey, look, we need to look at this timeline. As soon as you start getting rushed, you're going to start missing stuff, and that will bite you later. So while maybe you brought the project in, the 6 months that you promised, if you're constantly having to rework the processes because they really don't work that well, because you didn't take the time to fix them before you automated them, yeah, then you're going to drag out the pain of the painful side of the change. So yeah, deadlines with a cushion wherever you can. You know, make sure that, you know, your stakeholders are involved in setting those schedules. Talk with management about what's reasonable. And when they start pushing back or they want you to move faster, you know, be honest with them. Here's what we're dealing with, and here's why we think it's going to take longer. And, you know, I've had some great success with asking them too, like, well, this is how I scoped it. You're pushing on me. Did I miss something? Or do you have a different idea? Can we talk about that? Because maybe they have, you know, if your managers have had experience implementing other tools, maybe they have some ideas on how to speed things up. But it sure is important to make sure you've got a little bit of cushion here and there in your timelines, because any process change, I don't care how well planned it is, you're still going to run into bumps along the way. All right, Ashley, thank you. Oh, I love this picture. Be prepared for opposition. You know, you're going to have resistors. Anytime, you know, and maybe in the small startup space where you're implementing from scratch, this is a lot easier. But if you're switching off of an established paper system that's been around for a while, you're going to run into pockets of people who are very attached to the way that they're currently doing things. If I don't have this piece of paper, how do I know? How do I know if? So try to pull them into some meetings. They often have really amazing input into the process, or they have little pockets of information that that maybe you know, people don't generally know, especially if they've been around a while. So make sure that they have an opportunity to participate, that their voice is heard. It doesn't mean that you're going to change the scope of the whole project just because they had an input, and that should be made clear as well. You know, set those expectations, but make sure they feel heard and have and take that into consideration as you're going through the project, whether it's in the planning mode or, you know, you run into a roadblock along the way. Those are good opportunities for those resistors to speak up. And I've had it happen almost every time that my biggest resistors turn around and become my biggest champions, because once they're, you know, they're very passionate about their current position. Once you have engaged them and they start to buy in to the change, now they become very passionate about your system and your change and the new way forward. So I love turning those situations around. And most of the time they do turn around. All right. So a couple of customer stories. First one, let's see, as we jump around. Thanks, Ashley. Sidekick Health. We love these guys. They're over in Iceland, of all places. They're a software as a medical device company. They're in market. They've been around for 8 years. Not with Qualio necessarily for 8 years, but they have 60 users now. Yeah, they had some real challenges to deal with. They had 2 different products. They needed to get CE mark, and the whole MD to MDR transition kind of played into their timelines and such. You know, we were all rushing to get it done, and then it got delayed, and then, right. So anyway, but they needed a solution for growth. You know, they were, you know, well, 60 people, you know, that's actually pretty big for a startup, but they've been growing, ever since. So, they realized, you know, of course, and especially in software world, you know, you're already working electronically. Why would you do anything on paper, frankly? And so they needed a tool that was scalable, was going to grow with them, gave them that audit readiness and the robust documentation that they needed to get through the CE marking process and such. They came on board with Qualio. They're in our Plus program as well, which is an advisory program. It's kind of over and above just the software tool. We helped them set up their processes and such. And I'll have to check. At last check, I think they were through their initial ISO certification process, and then they were working through their tech files and such. The other customer, and we do serve a really broad variety, Clinical is a clinical development CRO. And so they've been around for a long time. They have almost 1,000 users. Obviously, they're in market, if you will, which is a little, different for the CRO space versus getting a product approved. Yeah, paper doesn't go with scale. Imagine chasing pieces of paper around with 950 employees. Not to mention the fact that while they do have a headquarter, they have a lot of distributed employees because depending on trials they have going on and those kinds of things, they're not entirely based out of one location. So, and as you all know, dealing with documentation around clinical trials is really documentation heavy, right? You're a lot more paper in that scenario. So yeah, scalable eQMS, simplicity. It was a big transition for them, and especially in that clinical space, where I don't think there's any space in this industry more constrained, restricted, I think, than the clinical trial space. So yeah, it needed to be easy, and it needed to work no matter where they were, and paper was just not working for them. All right. So how to evolve to a paperless eQMS, your complete guide. We have a white paper for you guys. And I believe, Ashley, we were doing a bit of a survey. This is not, specific to eQMS. We're really interested in your opinion from a quality, life sciences perspective. We don't get an opportunity terribly often to talk to so many people from all around the world. And we want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about all the different topics. And it's a short, quick survey. So if you would take a few minutes, we're giving away gift cards to go with that. All right.
Perfect.
I've got questions.
So, perfect. So I will launch it, and then this survey, so you can do it later, guys. So I think the interesting part, so thank you very much, Kelly, for this nice overview of everything. So now I think we have quite a lot of time to really ask the hard questions, guys. So we really need you, to think about what maybe Kelly talked about. And if you have questions to specific topics like scoping or anything that you want to hear more, so this is the time, because we have enough time for you to really think about what she discussed and go deep into Kelly's mind to understand the real issues. Okay, so feel free to shoot with questions, and I will launch the survey that you can open it now and just get back to it later. Okay, and maybe they can also email it to you.
Okay.
Nice. Okay, so I like it. You should be able to see it. So we can start maybe from the beginning of the real questions. So maybe from Gary. So maybe some examples where things went really bad and why they went really bad.
Sure. And of course, obviously we like to talk about the successes for sure and present on those, but failures, boy. There's lots of reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons that I have seen for an eQMS implementation not going well. I honestly can't say I've seen one where they just completely abandoned the system and said, we're not doing this. What I have seen is that I think we talked a little bit in the whole don't pave the cow path thing. Most of the time, the issues I've seen have either been that the system itself is so incredibly complicated that it's really hard for people to learn how to use. When you're implementing one of these tools and you're trying to get your arms wrapped around the entire scope of quality, it's a lot more than dot control and training, right? And I think I saw something in in the tool saying, do you have modules, or is it just an electronic document management system? So the first answer is no, we don't have modules. Yes, it is more than an electronic document management system because we don't believe in modules. Modules isolate data, create silos. So if the system is really complicated, it's hard to get compliance from the other parts of the organization where you need people to input. One of the big examples I've seen of a really painful implementation had to do with using an ERP tool like Oracle. We had a CRM tool. We had Salesforce in the mix, and then we had an electronic QMS tool where we were trying to tie all of those things together. And so the field staff who interacted with the customers were working in Salesforce. The customer success people who were, supporting customers who would call in to order more components or whatever, they were working in Oracle. And from a quality system perspective, of course, we're over here going complaint handling, but complaint handling, right? We need all this information for complaint handling. Trying to get the field reps to log into the quality system to do anything was nearly impossible. That wasn't their job. Their job was to sell product and support the product that they sold. And so what was supposed to be about 8 to 10 month implementation took us almost 2 years. And it took us 2 years because the process was too complicated and we didn't try to simplify it first. We simply tried to move our complaint handling to another system. There were integrations involved, and that didn't go well. A bunch of, Oracle's huge, right? Oracle can do anything and be anything, but only with a really huge investment and software engineers who are writing code to make it work, right? So that level of complexity within the tools themselves, and then you try to tie them together and run queries off of, keywords and that kind of thing. It made for a big challenge. And like I said, it ended up taking us probably close to 2 years. And then I left that organization, and last I heard, it's still a bit of a challenge. And unfortunately, what happens in all of that is that the QA people have to work that much harder to go out and actively seek the information they need, instead of everybody putting all the information in one place and then everybody can consume it. So yeah, that's I hope that's one, Gary. That's one experience I have with it not going well. So I'm gonna yeah, let's see what else. Are the slides available? Yep, we can make them available. Do you have an example of a small company? Estelle, I have a company that I work with in Austin, Texas, who is one guy. One guy working with a contract manufacturer distributing spinal implants. And that's a challenge because, he ends up, of course, sometimes having to figure out how to get around to proving his own work. But yeah, that's a small company. Really common in the device space. Pharma is a different animal. The way that you get your products to market and whatnot, in pharma being so much more rigid, more gated than a medical device. Anybody can, have an idea in their garage and work with a contract manufacturer to make it on the med device side, or even now this whole world of software is a medical device, right? There's not even a physical thing anymore. You see a lot more small companies in that space. So yeah, wide variety. I would say the average med device that I've seen that gets all the way to market usually ends up around 8 to 10 people total, if they're outsourcing most of their activities. How do you migrate an existing visual process flow diagram to a usable and intuitive hierarchical process in Qualio? That's a great question, Patricia. That one would take a long time to answer because it would depend. Which process are you talking about? As far as simple as you can drop a flowchart into a document, sure, in the system. As far as other processes like like a complaint process or a kappa process, the events area of our application gives you the opportunity to build out a workflow and make sure that certain information is captured at certain stages, and then the whole thing goes through that review and approve at the stages that you require. And our tool in particular is quite flexible in that space because at its core, all of these processes just used to be, forms and documents once upon a time, right? They don't need to be more complicated than that. And some of these bigger software systems I've seen in market and implemented personally, like I said, talking about the one that we did with that whole Oracle Salesforce integration thing, so complex. It was almost ridiculous how complex it was. And that's part of what contributed, I would say, to its failure. It didn't need to be that complicated to be compliant, but everybody had to have their input and their piece of information in the tool. So that project, I was a contributor. I didn't get to run it. If I had run it, I might have made some different decisions, but it's also easy to look back on these things. Hindsight's 2020, right? So, all right. Another question. How do you ensure the implementation period is 60 days or sooner with Qualio? What redundancies, limitations are factored into the time frame? From experience, the usual blocker is internal resource to perform the UAT stage, i.e. scripting, testing, approvals, etc. We provide the templates for that validation pack. So unless you want to write a whole lot more scripts, the validation usually takes about a week or so. We're multi-tenant, cloud-hosted, software as a service solution. We don't talk about customization because you can't in our tool. You can set up workflows, you can set up document templates and those kinds of things. But all of those things are done, the functionality to set those up and how they all behave is set by the software. And we really believe in keeping the processes as simple as possible. So I feel like some of our competitors who've been around a whole lot longer have really kind of done damage to the whole idea of an electronic QMS because they're so complicated. And everybody wants, every little thing to be controlled by the software. If you really step back and look at what is actually required by the regulations, not what's nice to have from a software control perspective, you can speed up everything. You don't have to go through crazy amounts of validation. All right. What can I do when other departments can't understand about eQMS? Whew, boy, we should probably run a whole webinar on that topic because that can be a tough one. At the end of the day, everybody in the company cares about getting their product out the door and that it's safe and effective, right? Nobody wants to hurt a patient. And so I think if you start from that place of, you can start from a place of regulatory requirements too, right? We all have our little books of here's the regs that you need to comply to, and we got to do this because the FDA or EMEA or whoever says so, right? Okay, that's not the way to gain buy-in. That's kind of trying to operate from a place of fear. I know as quality professionals, we tend to fall back to that place because it's safe for us, right? Getting everybody across an entire organization to understand the space you're operating in, right? This is regulated space. You can't just make a product and sell it and somebody's going to go implant it. That's not how this works. If you can get everybody on the same page for that message, we all care about our product helping other people. You can start to figure out what's the scope. Where does quality play into those things? What pieces of what they do need to be captured in your eQMS? Because it isn't 100% of the pieces either. And if you're in QA and you think that, then we should talk. But certainly the pieces that are critical to demonstrate that your product is safe and effective, that's usually where I start. Like, okay, guys, we're all in the same boat here. We're all trying to get this product out the door. The consequences of things going wrong mean more time and money later. So how do we prevent that up front? And so that's one way. The other way is always, the other thing I often find helps people understand is the first time you go through an audit. And it's certainly you would like to know what those things are before you get there. But sometimes it's really revealing to your head of operations, for example, to see the questions you're being asked by the regulators, because that makes it real for them, right? This isn't just because QA wants you to write everything down, right? This isn't just because, you didn't put a decimal in the right spot of that number. Here are the things we have to demonstrate to the auditor. I need you to help me help the company be successful in that setting. So I hope I'm answering your question there, but it is about the bigger picture. And the eQMS is the tool that helps you paint that bigger picture in color. All right. Sophie, is the solution to start to go for a part of the QMS in electronic? For instance, start with the documentation and training, and if it's work, go for the other part as kappa or other. Depends on how mature your existing quality system is. In a lot of cases when if you're in a startup situation, you want to make sure that your tool is capable of all of those things, but you don't necessarily have to implement all of those things until you're ready. If you have a mature quality system that's been around for a while, it's on paper, you're going to have to figure out some of the transitional things. Like, for example, how are you doing tracking and trending in your kappa process right now? Probably you're using a spreadsheet, because just doing it purely on paper is, who's still doing that these days? You'll need to plan for those kinds of things. And so staging your implementation is a good idea if you have a lot of very mature processes that you're going to need to figure out some implementation tricks along the way. I would say yes, you would want to do it in that situation. When we talk about 60 days of implementation, that's everything's in there, everything's ready. Whether or not you choose to start using your kappa workflow on day one, I've seen a lot of orgs, implement that more slowly. And that's where, at least from our perspective, we work with you to figure out what those timelines look like. We can do it that fast. And especially if you're in a startup situation where it's kind of new, it's easy to have it all in there, have it all, and then just start from day one. Okay, you've got a kappa, perfect. Well, your SOP is already effective. Your workflow is ready to go. Dive right in. But in the case where you're coming from a fairly mature quality system, it might make more sense to have those transitions managed. It can be a resource problem too, right? I mean, we all have day jobs that we have to do as well. And so, so if you're in a very resource constrained situation, you've got a QA team of 2 folks over there just trying to hold down the fort, it might make more sense to implement more slowly. So we can do it that fast. Doesn't mean we have to do it that fast. We will go with you along that journey. And so Mark Lawley, I guess your question kind of ties into that. When you say 12 to 24 months for implementation of an eQMS, is that for the entire eQMS? How long would you expect to implement just document management and training? Just document management and training, I would stand up right off the bat, first thing, and it doesn't take very long at all. It's getting your procedures in there, getting your training curriculums set up, and then having people start to train, in the system, and off you go. So that can be fairly quick. It's really once you start getting into a lot of your other quality system processes where you start to see a lot more time needed. But again, that there's so many, it depends, right? How big is your organization? How mature is that quality system? How many people are actively working in those processes versus, the big chunk of, basic users whose only job is to go in there and read procedures and train, right? That group of people is actually really easy to get off your plate. And then you can dive into the more complex processes behind it as you're going along. All right. Olga, how do you check regularly that people are using QMS? Sometimes you create QMS, do training, and then found that people forget it and not using it. Yep, It happens. This really goes to your overall culture of quality in your organization, making sure that people buy in, that they understand why. Why are we doing this? It's easier to ignore it, I think, in a paper process, because when you have the folks who don't do it very often, the training in a paper process is usually a group. If you do a PowerPoint, and you get everybody in a room and everybody signs a training record, right? So those things are very much managed by your QA people, and they're very much your QA reaching out. And eQMS starts to place some of that responsibility back in the hands of your users. And so it's, making sure people understand why this is important. Your system should give you visibility too, right? And you can't be, I would think, releasing product without certain items being checked off. So an eQMS should give you that visibility. But, does the eQMS give you a dashboard where you can go in and see that people are completing their training, for example? And if you can't see that, then it's a lot harder to enforce. We have some simple dashboards that give you that information right off the bat. You log in and you can see right across the top bar how many trainings have been assigned and how many are overdue. And then you can start to dig into that data. Do you help with establishment of the QMS if there really is none, starting from what a company needs? Quality plan, documentation, SOPs. Yes, we do. We call that Qualio Plus. It's a team. There are now, 7 of us. We just made an offer to somebody yesterday, so we're about to be 8. We have people in Europe. We have people in the US. We have people in pharma. We have people in device. So yeah, we have the base procedures you need to establish a quality system. Obviously, they're set up to work with our software tool, right? So, and then we provide you some guidance into what you need to do for your product and that kind of thing. We don't get into that. We're not consultants, but certainly from a quality system perspective. So doc control training, kappa, management review, internal audits, non-conformances, deviations, all of those core quality elements. Yes, we do have packages available where you get an advisor who's an expert in the quality space to work with you on getting all of that set up. Make sure you guys are trained. We offer that training. If you need training on ISO 13485, we can do that. So yeah. And that particular area of Qualio is, it's kind of my baby. It's a lot of fun. Let's see. Paramesh, how to transfer standalone equipment data with Handshake software for more accurate. We do have an open API with our tool. We are not a LIMS, however, and I know, but we can integrate with a LIMS. So the short answer to that is yes, we can. But with that particular implementation would require, someone who's an expert in the tool you're using to talk with our experts on how to make those things come together. And then what do you want that information to look like when it comes into your quality system? Is it as simple as, a document record that has the list of here's all the test results? Or is it something more than that? Would need to work out those details with you guys, but we are capable of doing such things. Adrian Gera, is Qualio a SaaS? Yes. What's the update upgrade life cycle for Qualio, and how long or easy is the validation testing? So yes, we're SaaS. We fix bugs in real time. So those deployments are happening. We use automated testing tools on our side that cover the vast majority of the code base. So we meet the OQ functionality testing requirements by using automated tools. And QA has some oversight into what that looks like. We have software engineers and test who write those scripts, et cetera, et cetera. As far as validation testing process take place, depends. Depends on the scope of the change. Sometimes it's a simple addition of a function that, or it's changing the reporting screen to add more information. If you're revalidating every single time on a display screen, we should talk about applying a risk-based approach, because you don't need to validate that every time. keep it simple. But bigger features, bigger functionality. Right now we're deploying those on kind of a once a quarter basis. And we provide the updated validation scripts in an addendum to you as a customer so that you can go through it. And some of our functions are behind feature flag. So if you're in the pharma space, for example, you're probably not going to use our design control tool, right? And so we can turn that on or off for you. And if it's off, you won't even see it. So when we release updates that just touch design control, for example, then for you, there wouldn't be any validation impact. Okay. So we try to make it easy. And that's part of, as a company and having a quality team from the industry they serve on staff, we're involved in the change management process. We're involved in the product development process. And our purpose for being in that is to make sure that those exact questions that customers like you would ask are always thought of when we go through that change control process. So we do validation, risk assessment, and we have a formal change management process where we go through all of that for all of the features and things that we change or update. Do auditors get the chance to go through a company's Qualio system? Victor, I'm not sure if you mean like regulatory authorities. You could grant them that access. Absolutely. You control who has access to your data. We don't do that. So if you wanted to, and I run audits this way all the time. I set up certain documentation I want to make available to them. And I grant my auditor, and we get audited by customers all the time. We're also ISO certified, so we're dealing with notified bodies. We wouldn't be inspected by the FDA directly, for example, but notified bodies, those kinds of regulatory authorities all the time. I set them up in my system. Here's all the SOPs and things. I can even make certain types of other evidence records available to them. And, I always ask for an agenda up front so that I make sure I've covered all of those bases. And then I let them loose within the boundaries of here's the things you're allowed to look at. Boy, it makes audits go easy because they can go back to it in their own time. And I'm sure once more in-person auditing starts to come back online, right? Obviously, these last 2 years we've all been living through have been a little a different approach, but having an electronic QMS of any kind makes that so much easier. You can invite them directly into your system, and you can restrict them to only see the information you want them to see. And then we get together at the end of this audit to talk about, where I show them any evidence that maybe isn't in the system, right? Or I don't turn anybody loose in my kappas, for example. So that's a curated experience. I like to go through those things with them so they understand what's happening. But we invite auditors into our system all the time. And some of our customers, it's interesting, when Clinical audited us, he had never done an audit that way. And he got through and he just had all this amazing feedback. He's like, "It's so great. This is so easy. And I can just go back to the procedure, if I need, like as I'm going back through my checklist or I'm writing my report, like, oh, I know I saw this somewhere, this has just been great. It's been a great experience. I'm going to start doing this with my customers." It's like, yay, glad to hear it. How long does it take to validate the software to be in compliance with 21 CFR Part 11? That's baked into the pack. And it's a handful of tests. The software doesn't do 100% of that compliance. There are pieces of that you have to do. You have to have a procedure in place to make sure people understand that it's an electronic record, that kind of thing. But that's baked in. It's user permissioning, log in, log out. It's not very hard. And if people are taking longer than, a few test scripts to get that done, then I would question the I would question the scope of the risk assessment that you did, because it's not all the same. All right. Let's see. Another question from Rob. If you were migrating from one eQMS to Qualio, would you bring over all versions of your QMS documentation like SOPs and work instruction, or only the current versions? What about product documentation? I would think you'd want to bring all of those for design history, but maybe just the current versions would be okay leading up to the finished product. We can manage this a couple different ways. What people often do is when we set up that initial SOP, for example, if they're bringing old versions and they don't have another repository to keep the old versions in, we will attach the old versions to the first one when it's first released into the system. And so that the history will be there. Because certainly in a published organization, you need to maintain that history. But this is another place too where I would look at your retention schedules, right? So if your retention is life of the device plus 2 years and the life of your device is a year, do you need to have 10 years worth of stuff in your quality system? No. Under the regs, you only need to have 3. So you can limit based on that kind of thing. And the same breath, it's an electronic quality system and we're cloud hosted and there's no limits on space. So we can bring all that stuff in. And we can put, the other thing I've seen people do is create a template for archive records and then put all the archive records onto those templates and not onto the SOP template. Because again, the thing you want to avoid is cluttering up your quality system. Any electronic, any software tool, I don't know if you guys have used, something like SharePoint. SharePoint can get to be a hot mess really quickly because it's almost too easy to just put everything in there and not be thoughtful about how you organize it. So, as far as like your products and design history files and those kinds of things, yeah, same story, right? What is your retention required to be? What is the value of, the drawing from 20 years ago? Depends, right? I mean, you could argue you don't have to have it if the life of your device is 3 years. At the same time, in my time as a quality engineer, being able to go back to old versions of things was important to my troubleshooting process. But the old versions of things like that weren't in the main QMS. They were in a different repository. So just depends on your business and your processes. As a general rule, we tend to say, we discourage you from cluttering up your quality system with every record you have under the sun. But certainly once you start getting into, this is where scoping and assessing the kinds of data you have in your organization is such an important step, big time, because then you can start to draw some boundaries around what that looks like. All right. Do you currently have risk assessments in your document workflow? Yes. Also, what about with the CSV, CSA? Yes, we do. It can look different in different places. In our workflow area where you're doing kappas and such, it's explicitly called out on when you create the kappa, and then you can always go back and adjust it because it's hard to guess, right? Right off the bat, something looks really terrible. Once you investigate and start to determine your root causes, the risk might change associated with that, right? So that's built into those workflows. Built into our documents area in the change control is, what's changing, why is it changing, what's the impact at a minimum, and you can customize that template as well if you want to ask more questions of your change author, including building in a whole risk assessment, section to that, you can do that. Yeah, and then CSV, CSA, sure. Yeah, we absolutely, our risk assessment is included in that pack I was talking about when we provide all the template documentation. And then you would review that and accept it as is, or if you need to add more granularity, you could, based on how you plan to use the tool. Noel, do companies take all modules at the same time or take their time by implementing 2 or 3 at a time? I think we addressed this one already kind of earlier when we talked about it. It really depends on your business. The good news is, at least for us at Qualio, it's not a module. You don't have to, some of the eQMS tools in the market, you have to, each element is a module and you have to buy those additional modules later, so you start off with docs and training and then maybe you add deviation or kappa or whatever later and it's a whole new module. In our tool, they're not modules. And the workflow area we call events is capable of handling just about any kind of workflow you might want to build. So I've got customers using it, for the typical stuff, right? Deviation, kappa, complaint handling. But I've also seen it used for big change control projects. I've seen it used for facility cleanliness checks. You put the little checklist into the box and you assign QA issues the record, and they assign that set of tasks to the person who, walks the floor and does those checks, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's, you can implement all of them. You can wait and only implement what you need and then implement it later. And we're not going to charge you more. You don't have to buy another module to do, because now you're ready to do kappa. All right. Does the eQMS sit on top of SharePoint for doc storage? Ours does not. Ours is our own hosted database. I have not seen an integration with SharePoint yet either, although, I suppose you could. But no, it's we use Amazon Web Services. The data is hosted in Europe. The application runs on those servers as well. And yeah, there are tools out there, and certainly to talk about some competitors, I have seen a tool that's built on top of Salesforce, for example. The good news is it's Salesforce, and so trying to get information from field staff, for example, would be very easy because they already live and work there. The downside is it's very complex because it's a big Salesforce database, right? And the interface is very Salesforcey. I haven't seen anything that does SharePoint. I've seen some homegrown stuff around SharePoint, but anytime you build a tool that sits on top of another tool and you don't have control over the updates to that tool, unless you have a, on-prem hosted version of SharePoint, it would break. Microsoft releases, feature changes fairly quickly. All right. Kindly elaborate about the requirements, testing, and validation part for migration steps, point 1. Let me think back to the slide deck. And Jan, how are we doing on time?
So we have 20 more minutes according to our timeline. So do you want me to launch on specific slide?
No, I think I've got this one. I just wanted to check in on time. Okay. I couldn't recall how much longer we got, but this is great. I'll keep going. You guys keep firing away the questions. I love it. This is a great conversation. Okay. The requirements for testing and validation. We consider ourselves a GAMP Category 3 system. So GAMP is Good Automated Manufacturing Practices. For those of you who don't know, it's version 5. It's a bit dated, but unfortunately, there isn't a lot of newer guidelines out there. So until some better guidance comes out, we fall back, to what we know. GAMP isn't recognized internationally as an approach, and it's one approach. So the documentation we provide is in alignment with that. Starts with the user requirements. Obviously, so we provide the template for the user requirements, and it has the list of all the requirements, that our system does. As a customer, you would review that and accept it. If you wanted some more granularity, you could update that. You couldn't require things that the system doesn't already do, however, because then you'd bomb your validation. But certainly keeping in mind, we partner with you on that. This is what our tool is capable of. Here's the URS. Part of standing it up, I know I touched a little bit on the supplier validation or supplier qualification piece. The reason that's important with a SaaS provider is because you don't own the system. You don't own the code. That kind of, when we're talking about manufacturing equipment, for example, it was always an important part of the validation process to understand, will this machine still run if the company goes out of business? What happens to, the software or the firmware that runs it? And that, you review it, look for dead code and have escrow and all that kind of stuff. None of that stuff is relevant to a SaaS contract because you don't own it. We do. We're providing you a place to host your data. And so, you know, if we were to go out, for example, we would provide you all of your data back and we'd all move on, but you don't own a copy of Qualio that way. That's not how SaaS in general works. So user requirements, risk assessment, user acceptance testing. So again, scripts that cover the core functionalities of the system, and traceability matrix. Those are the core documents. Around that, you want to have copies of our software development lifecycle policy, our change management policy, so that you understand how we are building the software, fixing the software, updating the software, and managing those changes. You should understand all of that, and that's part of that whole supplier qualification process, which hopefully you're doing before or during the purchasing process. Excuse me. And then data backup and recovery. That's the other piece. So in a cloud-hosted multi-tenant solution, I can only speak for us. I can't speak for everybody, but we don't have the ability to just parse your data out so that you can back it up in some private location. We back up the entire application, the entire database, everybody's data every day. Runs, you know, there's scripts that run that, and then we exercise the restore. You know, we do a restore exercise, disaster recovery drill, if you will, on an annual basis. And so part of the partnership that you establish with your vendor, you still meet all of those requirements, but you're outsourcing pieces of those requirements to us. And all of that should be explained in your supplier file. We encourage quality agreements, you know, and we have a template for that, or, you know, we're happy to take a look at yours, and, you know, we can come to a mutual agreement on what that needs to look like. But all of those things around the actual validation itself covers the scope of all the requirements that you have to meet. So I hope that answered your question. I don't want to get into the details too much of test this, test that. You should test what's appropriate for you, how you're going to use the system. We can do single sign-on, for example. A system is capable of it. Should you validate that if you're not going to use it? No. It's a waste of time. And if you don't use it and you don't have it set up, you can't test it, right? So going through those documents and making sure you understand the scope of what's happening and then how you are going to use the system is the first step in the whole process. From there, it gets really easy. Again, there's no software custom code being written by a team of, you know, engineers in another room in order to make this tool work and do all the things that you have to do. All right. How many people do you need to implement eQMS? Depends. You know, I think in the old world, we used to say like quality was about 10% of an organization. Quality department should be rough numbers, right? That's assuming like a manufacturing organization, right? Where you've actually got in-house manufacturing going on. I don't know what those numbers look like these days, given the trend towards everybody outsourcing to common, you know, contract manufacturing organizations and that kind of thing. You do need a champion. You do need someone who owns the system. Maybe they don't own the processes that happen in the system, right? The person who owns the administration of the system doesn't have to also be the person who owns kappa, right? Who owns training compliance, who owns document control. But somebody needs to own it. And that person needs to know it really, really well, and then empower other people to do their job using the tool, whether that's helping build workflows, making sure people get the right training, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so I've done this in organizations where, you know, seriously, there's 5 employees and it's one person implementing. So it doesn't have to be, and I see your next question here. Do you need people who are IT competent to assist in implementing the system? No. Nope, sure don't. It's web-based. There's nothing hosted on your site. There's nothing about permissions and all those kinds of firewalls and networks, and all of that stuff is not needed when you go with a cloud-based hosted solution. Your processes should be simple enough that the people who own those processes can then figure out how to use the tool to support them. And that's not IT. So no, does not require IT to implement. And in fact, the vast majority of the smaller companies that we work with don't have IT, or if they do, it's outsourced. And the scope of that IT department is keeping everybody's computers running. So yeah. If you need IT to implement, you're probably implementing something complex. And there's places where that's appropriate for sure, but that's not true 100% of the time. All right. How is the IT infrastructure qualified? High availability, redundancy, business continuity. So in a cloud-based SaaS scenario, we own that. You guys don't have to. We own that. A good vendor will have documentation around how they do it and those kinds of things. And we do. We have policies in place. We can make those available to our customers to review. And then as far as, qualifying infrastructure, this isn't a world where, there's a server in an office somewhere and it's hooked to a network and all those kinds of things, right? This is the cloud. You can get to it through any web browser. So as far as how the infrastructure on the back is managed, a good cloud vendor will have documentation around that to answer those questions when they come up in an audit. But it's also in the quality agreement that you are effectively outsourcing that piece of the pie to us, to your vendor. All right. What is the general data storage retention policy for eQMS in terms of number of years or data size? Well, okay. So for Qualio in particular, we don't delete anything. So if you put data in the system, it's there. If you want to take that data out of the system, if it's been an approved record already, you actually can't delete it. All you can do is retire it. To kind of get it out of the library and put it into a separate location that only certain, level of access can get to. You can comply with whatever retention requirements you have as an organization. So there's legal considerations, there's GDPR considerations, there's, and then, like I said, if we go back to, from a regulated, life science regulated perspective, it's, what life of device +2 or life of device +3, shelf life +2, those kinds of things. That's where you get into that. And that's really up to you guys. So that was a lot of words for, I don't have one. It depends on your business and what you're doing as far as those requirements. As far as Qualio is concerned, it's indefinite and there's no restriction on data size. That's one of the other beauties of being cloud hosted. It's not like you're going to run out of server space. Again, we use AWS. We have load balancers in place. And so when the database gets bigger, we fall over to another server. And AWS manages all that infrastructure. We don't. So, all right. If a company already has SOPs and documentation, would that documentation be transferred onto the templates you offer, or is it left as is? So like SOPs and stuff, we usually take the content and transfer it into, because our tool uses a built-in document editor. You can attach things in that are like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, whatever, but the records themselves in our system, there's a built-in editor. So on that initial migration, and this is part of what we talk about in the scoping, is will this information need to be managed in the future, or is this like a one-time deal where you're just going to, dump in a PDF and you can attach it to a record? Those, fine, that can be done too. But in general, your SOPs and such, we would move those into the templates. And so if you don't already have a standard format for your SOP, would be a good time to understand why. And one use case I've seen is like lab procedures have different sections, right? So we just make those their own template. So you got your standard quality system procedures with purpose, scope, responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have your lab SOP template, which has purpose, scope, responsibilities, materials and safety, right? All the other pieces that kind of play into that. And we would work with you to figure out what that looks like. And then if you came up with a new document type later, you could always create it. You're not locked into fixed document types with Qualio. So, you know, you could add another record type to the system later if you needed to. All right. Question from Eva. Who will be qualified people responsible for implementation of eQMS? Is there any case where eQMS is not involved? I'm not sure I entirely understand your question. Who's qualified to do it is, you know, who owns the process in your organization that you're trying to automate or implement, right? Who owns dot control? As far as qualified, I guess I'm not understanding. Do we certify people in Qualio implementation? No. And it's not necessary to do such a thing. You know, I think working with the vendor, you know, we have people who help you do that. Who's qualified on your side of the organization? I would say roll with your process owners. They're the ones who know the processes best and then can figure out how to translate those processes into a new electronic tool. Let's see. Helen, does Qualio have a system process for product traceability from recs to specs? Yes, we sure do. That is our design control feature. And yeah, it does that. And it can do that either using internal documents as the repository of information. We also have the ability to integrate the document control feature to a tool like Jira or Azure Development. So if your software is a medical device company, or you have a medical device that has a software component and you're using an external tool like Jira to manage the work and the requirements and such, we can actually tie to that tool. And what's great about that is that, you know, sometimes what quality people are looking for from a traceability perspective is different than what your software engineers are looking for example. And so we can use that integration to translate it into what we need on the QA side, but your engineers can still work in Jira. So, so yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we do manage those things. All right, let's see. Sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, Keith, what in your experience is the biggest single challenge that a micro SME med dev company is likely to face when transitioning from paper-based to an eQMS? I'm not sure that there's a challenge that is unique to that kind of company, to be honest. I think that you'll run into the same challenges that we've been talking about all along, right? People are very attached to their paper processes. They want it to see it a certain way. When they're attached to those processes, they're resistant to change to an electronic system because they feel like it's taking away their control. It's very easy to control a piece of paper that you can hold in your hand, right? And so I think the attachment to the paper, the feeling like you're giving up control when in reality you really aren't. You're actually gaining control because you're not chasing paper around the office, or people can, you know, paper can disappear, frankly. So I don't know that I would say that there's a single challenge unique to that type of company. Can you please tell me how we can minimize the document distribution system? I would assume this means like controlled copy paper floating around the plant kind of situation. Going electronic will absolutely solve that problem. Then your challenge becomes, what technology do you need to make available at point of use, right? So ours, a lot of manufacturing facilities these days, if you go electronic, you know, they're putting like tablets and so touch screens and those kinds of things into the manufacturing facility for the operators. That's the best way, you know, make devices available at the point of use, and then you no longer need to distribute paper. All right, question from Patricia. When progressing through checklists within a workflow, can the workflow be configured depending branched on which answers were selected in the checklist? Right now, today, we can't do that yet, but it is on our roadmap. So yeah, it's a feature we're working on. Makes the events area more complicated, but yeah, we're working on that functionality because that would be really handy. How often does your software get updated, upgraded? I'm worn out from Microsoft's constant upgrades. Yeah, I hear you on that one. I totally agree. And that's part of what I was struggling with when we first started this was that, you know, so I work on a MacBook and it doesn't like PowerPoint. And so yeah, I hear you on that. Bug fixes are real time. Like I said, if something's broke, we're going to fix it. And we're going to make sure, you know, that said, bug fixes are not changes to functionality either, right? They're restoring something that should have been working to make it work again. So those kinds of things, you'll see in our change log. You know, if you looked at our change log, you would see a lot. You know, you'd see a lot of little fixes here and there, and things that we're working on and stuff. Things that actually have validation impact. Things that will change workflows. Right now, like I said, I think I mentioned earlier that we're looking at a quarterly cadence. But even that quarterly cadence is very broad. If you don't use the design control feature, for example, and that quarter's release is design control, you wouldn't see it. So we're sensitive to this because as exciting as it is as a SaaS company to constantly be updating, we love, giving you new functionality. We also recognize that in this industry, that means change, that means validation, that means all of these other things. And even maybe if it doesn't require revalidation, but it does require you to update your SOP, right? That you wrote on how to do training in the system, for example. We're sensitive to that. So right now it's quarterly, and I think there may be some bigger features planned but it's not constant. So excuse me, I hope that helps. What about companies that are reluctant to migrate to the cloud? Yep, I hear this a lot as well. And my response to that is always, unless you are implementing on a private closed network internally that never sees the internet, you are not any safer in that scenario. I think people worry about data transmission and hacking and all that kind of stuff. And absolutely, there's those are risks. You bet. Risks of being in the cloud. And so you should work with a company who is committed to things like ISO 27001 security practices, for example, making sure they're using the latest and greatest best practices around, like data encryption and all that kind of stuff. So, and I see another question further up. There's a reluctance in some biopharma companies to use cloud solution. How can you ensure confidentiality, et cetera? Yeah, I can see that, and especially in the scenario where, you've got your intellectual property that you're putting into this tool. Assess your vendor, assess the quality system, assess their security practices, all of those things. That's how you get confidence around those things. Because being in the cloud these days is not a bigger risk than having, like I said, unless you're going to do an on-prem solution with a completely closed network that never sees the internet, you're going to get, the hacking happens to those guys too. So, yeah, I think in general, as people, we've all gotten a lot more comfortable with having technology at our fingertips and right in our pockets, right? The vendor you choose should be committed to your data security and whatnot. And you should assess that in your vendor selection process. All right. I think I already answered the question about distribution of SOP and documents. Like I said, it's got to be available at point of use. So have a computer, have a tablet available to your operators, to your chemists, those things, if you don't want to maintain paper books. That's how you make that available. Yes, there will be a recorded session available to you all when we're done here. And yeah, last question I have in this in this area. Can you combine Qualio with an existing eDMS? So I assume document management solution. Yes. So we've recently set up an integration with Box, for example, for customers that have a lot of old documents and they want to maintain that in a repository, but they don't necessarily, so it's still got to be available, but not cluttering up their QMS. Yes, we can integrate to those kinds of systems. If you were going to push the whole document back and forth, I'd want to understand why, because you're making something, I think, a little more complicated. But if you have an existing document management tool that you want to stick with, and you're looking to a tool like Qualio to then come in and do the other parts, right? You want to use us for kappa and complaints or whatever. That would be an interesting use case, and yeah, we could definitely talk about what that might look like. All right. Well, Jan, I think I'm out of questions.
Yeah, so right on time, I would say.
Yeah, it's a good thing. I was just looking down like, oh, 1:30. All right, perfect.
Yeah.
We did
so,
it.
Yeah, Kelly, so thank you very much for all those insights. So, of course, in those webinars, we can give so much information that we can in this period of time. So feel free to digest everything that we discussed, and if you have some information that you want to know about maybe some specific areas where you want us to meet here again and discuss some specific topics which Kelly mentioned, like some of the integrations issue or how to overcome specific problems that you have in mind. So maybe that would be also a good idea. So feel free to message us. Also leave it in the survey about the topics. And please, I opened a discussion in a LinkedIn group which is connects specifically to this webinar, where you can discuss with the peers about it, and just throw idea with yourself, maybe ask questions, maybe Kelly can pop up later and also maybe take a look at it. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it. Please answer the surveys that you will get from us to make sure that we are on track, because for us it's important that you get as much value as you can from this short time that we have. Right. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope to see you at the next ones. And please don't forget also Qualio's survey, and expect emails with certificates and the documentation that you will get in the next days. Yeah, thank you guys. Good. So. Awesome. Yeah, so I will end the sessions, and Kelly and Ashley, feel free to jump into the meeting that we have afterwards. So everybody have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.